Welcome back to Conversations with the Leaky, Cauldron, episode 21, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, chapters 24 through, I believe, 30, yes, the White Tomb. And back with me are my esteemed colleagues, Ms. Sarah Miller and Mr. Wes Schantz. Welcome back.
It's good to be back.
Hey, y'all. Good to be back with you.
Good to have you two back. And so we're talking about this time, sectumsempra, the seer overhead, chapter 25, 26, the cave, 27, the lightning-struck tower, 28, flight of the prince, 29, the phoenix lament, and 30, the white tomb. I know that I had been texting with y'all, and I said that I really wanted to lay out some of the connections between the cave of the Horcrux, where Dumbledore is so severely weakened, and epic portrayals of the underworld. But I also just wanted to ask, what were y'all interested in this reading, this final reading of book 6, this final reading before we embark upon the final Harry Potter?
Gosh, it's such a bittersweet part of the series for me. It's, really sad, of course, but it's also the moment when you, I think, see Harry become, a man, basically, like sort of grows up in this moment.
I was personally interested in, I was crying when Dumbledore dies. I'm really interested in how we read the scenes, at the astronomy tower and in the chase afterwards. If we didn't know the end, like, had I not read all of the 7th book and learned kind of a different way of seeing things, I'm really interested in like what we make of Dumbledore's last words. I'm really interested in the funeral scene, and kind of how there's so much like really overt discussion of what death means, and like what if anything Harry gets out of this death that is different from what he learns from the deaths of his parents and the deaths of Cedric and Sirius. Like, what does this one do that the others don't, I suppose? I'm also really interested in like how things change for him and Ginny, just because I'm like really surprised at how persuaded I was by their like relatively mature affection for one another. Just considering how young they are, but and especially their parting of ways. I'm really interested in that. So I'd love to hear what else y'all have to say.
Well, I think it'd be really useful to quote from those sections, the funeral scene and the death scene and the dying words. I'd be interested in sharing and looking and finding those and giving some direct comments on them. But Wes, what did you think about that theme of death and how Harry was handling death, and what this death was, how this death differed from the ones before? It seemed to have been getting increasingly personal. Of course, the first one was the most personal in many ways.
I think it's interesting how this whole book, we've been hearing about these inferi, right? These reanimated corpses, like they don't appear, and then finally at the very end, there they are under the water, and Dumbledore is completely fine with it, right? He's like, oh yeah, there's some dead people in the water, but they won't hurt you, right? They're just bodies. And so I find that aspect of it really interesting, right? The difference between Dumbledore's attitude towards death and, Harry's on the one hand, but also the Voldemort's, of course, is very striking. And that attitude has been there since the very first book. I think we looked at this passage recently at the Norwescon. It was when Dumbledore says, death to the well-ordered mind is just the next, great adventure, or something like that, right? It's it's just a thing that he seems to not fear in the least. And so for all that we see him, weak in this moment, in another way, he seems prepared. And yeah, that parting, I found it interesting. Like, I don't remember what happens in the seventh book really at all. So I'm very much in suspense here, like how to go back and interpret some of this stuff that's happening. But I do vaguely remember that we're going to go visit some people's homes, including the home of Harry's parents, right? Godric's Hollow. Is that where he's, where they died? So I'm, very interested how, the death and the separation also brings him back full circle, right, to the place where he was a little child.
For sure. And just thinking about the name Godric's Hollow, that'll be interesting to think about in the context of Godric Gryffindor and how nowhere truly is safe. And I think that's part of what this death means, just to not touch on the personal note, because I do think that this is the most meaningful and most deeply personal death, because it's also a deeply symbolic death for Harry. It's the death of the safe magical world in which he's just a young boy sort of hero and has a paternal father protector figure. And so does the whole wizarding world. And when he dies, some like golden net of safety disappears from the world for all of wizarding kind, but especially for Harry, who had received so much special consideration and so much protection, frankly, from Dumbledore, not just physical, but magical and mentorial, and even inquisitional, or legally. He came to his defense of the Wisengamot at one time. And so that's gone from the wizarding world, from the opposition against Voldemort, and from Harry's life. And so it's as if he now has to rise up as an actual symbol of hope, not just what Scrimjaw wants to use him as. So incidentally, he will manage to play that role to a T. But he's going to have to become that for the world or the next generation. He's going to have to embody that which Dumbledore no longer embodies. And just to attach that to the underworld theme thing, mythologically, that is what happened. The old blind king is killed by an evil force. Or, in Norse mythology, it's actually the king and the Odin and Loki, the mischief god, who pull one over on people. So, just because of the interplay of Snape and Dumbledore here, whether Dumbledore is actually the old blind king who gets killed by the malevolent other half or not, I think is an open question. But let's say for the moment, from our understanding, that he does. The old blind king is killed by the malevolent force, the Scar, the Lucifer, the Cain figure. And then the hero has to go down to the underworld and find the old wise or the old blind king, and then bring him back to Earth and give him a new form. And I think that's what we see happening with Harry. And I think that's also the symbolic way to interpret growing up and facing the actual dangers of the world, just to make a long story long.
That's okay. I was curious about the descent element of it. How, in particular, how Harry is forced to keep Dumbledore drinking the potion, right? I found that such a unsettling, element of the story there, where, he shouldn't be there in the first place, right? There should be an enchantment that keeps it, to limit it to one wizard, right? And we're told Harry doesn't even show up on the power meter there because he's too young or something. But then on the other hand, he forces Dumbledore to drink that potion to the dregs, right? That was so messed up. I felt like, and it goes on and on. There's that part of the story, and then of course the brilliant, nefarious use of the water. Right, the only water that will work, that won't be enchanted away, is the water that will also, wake the dead and trigger their attack on the island. I found that so messed up and so delightfully like awful, that whole sequence there. I'm curious what you guys thought was going on there.
I mean, Alex, you definitely mentioned this in our pre-show texting a while ago, I suppose. So maybe it has something to do with some of the like Inferno-esque quality of this cave. It is it's sort of like it has some elements of the Inferno in its descent, right? Like the things that, the suffering that one must endure to, or rather for Harry, that one must observe in order to learn something. That having to like pass through a cave where there's some kind of like rite of passage, rather than, tossing some kind of sop at Cerberus. There's a blood price that's required. He goes with a guide, etc. It's hard not to see some of the like Inferno, Aeneid, Book 6-ish overtones. But yeah, the idea that the thing that should save you is the thing that weakens you, right? It's also when I phrase it like that, the Half-Blood Prince as a textbook, or the Half-Blood Prince's potions book saved Harry in his aspirations to become, an Auror. And it also provided him with the skills to be able to get the Felix Felicis, to be able to get the memory. So in that sense, like using that book saves him in a way, but it also like just deeply exposes him to Snape, forgetting what we learn about it later. But and then finally, like just this repeated theme of like the thing that allegedly makes one weak is the thing. The thing that could save you, water, is the thing that also makes him weak. Is, to me, like, I thought it was sort of a symbol of like the physical and maybe emotional sacrifice required, like to, fulfill a duty or one's mission. In that sense, like what Dumbledore does sort of prefigures what Harry will have to do. I don't know. I'm not sure what else you guys think.
That's really interesting, focusing on the water motif, because I for sure agree that there are the underworld tropes there as well as the Inferno tropes. I mean, you have to cross a body of water. That's something that's done in the Iliad, Book 24, famously compared to underworld scenes, and the Odyssey as well. In the Aeneid, you have to cross a lake, Acheron, or rather Ornos, or whatever it's called, but then you cross the Styx and the Cocytus too. When you're in there, there's a river crossing, and there's often a ferryman. So the fact that there's a self-farrier, I think, is an interesting alteration of the motif. You don't have a Charon, you don't have a Phlegyas there. You have Dumbledore's sort of intelligence. So again, there's like something missing, whereas Harry is the number two that shouldn't be there. It's almost as if that therefore makes Dumbledore the psychopomp, or the Charon, the person who crosses the river with him. And it's interesting then, in crossing the river, which is also a metaphor for, living a life, he is sort of going from the land of the living to the land of the dead. He will be irreversibly wounded here, even more grievously than when his hand was wounded, which has been such a focus of horror for Harry, sort of a Gilgamesh scene, Keto and the worm coming out of his eyes moment of just like the reality of finitude in this world. But I like what you said about water hurting Dumbledore, Sarah. because it makes me think of Leaky and forgetting and and remembering good times. It makes me think also of the idea of this not being the water of life, which is also an epithet for whiskey, but being more like the water of wisdom, which means contemplation of death and your own weakness and your own culpabilities in this world. I do wonder whether what Dumbledore is facing in these moments is his own personal hell, is facing all the mistakes that he's made during the course of his life, and that this is sort of like an atonement or a final like purification rite. And I do think it's deeply symbolic that they didn't use fire as the element to get out of this place. That it's a fire spell that gets rid of these inferi.
Yeah, I like that interpretation a lot, that this is somehow forcing Dumbledore to see all of the bad things that he did or mistakes that he made or something like that. Maybe, all the good things that he didn't do are included there too, right? Things he never got around to, that he wasn't able to do for whatever reason. And it strikes me that that's the sort of thing that, would have a particularly powerful effect against somebody the more good-hearted they are, right? They're more susceptible to that sort of thing having a terrible toll on them. So it's, again, I think a really striking kind of setup here that we're shown, and then it's capped off by the fact that the Horcrux has already been taken, which is like the last reveal. That's the real blow here, right? That this was all in vain. And I honestly don't remember who RAB is, so I don't even know what to do with that.
I think I remember, but man, that was a kick in the gut, wasn't it? And then it's all for nothing, and it's just so hard to argue against that line of reasoning with Harry in that moment, because it is a moment of nihilism. I feel like when Dumbledore is dead, it's like, well, so now Voldemort wins, right? And so there's not just that personal impact on Harry, but also just that getting the wind knocked out of you, and then to have his death seemingly be meaningless. And what does that say about one's ability to live a meaningful life, because he's had this extraordinarily long life and then he dies for nothing? It just, what is the lesson there? Is it that at this moment, without knowing what we know from the future, what could we say?
My take on this is one of Harry being forced to watch, right? It's kind of placing him in this position of being able to see what's happening but not being able to do anything about it, which I found really interesting, given that he has been such a heroic, active character all along, not always like fully understanding maybe what was going on, but still doing the right thing in the right moment and it working out for him. And so this sort of reverses that process, where normally he saves the day and then we have the scene where he's in Dumbledore's office and things are sort of explained and laid out for us. Here it's reversed, and we don't see, right, what's going on in Dumbledore's mind here. We never find out, but we hear him instead talking to Malfoy on the rooftop and kind of leveling with him, and it looks like it's about to work. And if Harry were free, maybe things would have gone differently, but for whatever reason, Dumbledore immobilizes him, hides him, allows this to happen, it seems, perhaps saves Malfoy from an unforgivable curse, right? And to all appearances has sacrificed himself for nothing, really, and kind of needlessly. It's this awful sense of a waste of a thing that we had been sort of trained to expect, then being withheld and taken away and just not being there anymore. it's desolation.
Ooh, that's a good word. Desolation. I think a couple things to pick up on what you said, Wes, to like make Harry watch and make him watch like petrified. I think obviously petrified can mean, turned into stone, but also just turned into fear, right? Paralyzed by fear. And he's, petrified with that petrificus totalis. And he's forced to watch this thing. Earlier in the story, when Harry and Dumbledore, I think it's earlier in this book even, when Harry and Dumbledore are sort of having a tiff of sorts about, Harry keeps coming back to the prophecy. The prophecy says this, the prophecy says that. And Dumbledore says, like, stop putting so much stock in the prophecy. You would want to do this. You would want to go after him, whether or not you had ever heard the prophecy, right? I'm forgetting exactly where that is, but I want to say it's in the chapter where he and Dumbledore discuss like the memory that he got from Slughorn.
Yeah, the end of that, I think, chapter.
Yeah, and it's a chapter. I think it's the last one of the passages that we read last time, and he basically has this moment of very serious contemplation. I think it's the end of chapter 23, where he thinks, it matters how you face death, right? It matters how, do you face it standing up, or do you face it being dragged into the arena? And the last thing he wants to see is the death of his protector. I mean, I think it's in the chapter where they have the funeral, where it's during the eulogy where Harry just turns, I think it's like page 644 or something, where it all sweeps over him, this dreadful truth, more completely and undeniably than it had until now, that Dumbledore was dead, gone. And to him, it's compounded by the fact that the locket was a fake, but he sees that, and this is on page 645, he saw very clearly as he sat there under the hot sun how people who cared about him had stood in front of him one by one, his mother, his father, his godfather, and finally Dumbledore, all determined to protect him. He could not let anybody else stand between him and Voldemort. He must abandon forever the illusion he ought to have lost at the age of 1, that the shelter of a parent's arms meant nothing could hurt him. There was no waking from his nightmare, no comforting whisper in the dark that he was safe really, that it was all his imagination. The last and greatest of his protectors had died, and he was more alone than he had ever been before. And that's when he sees the Phoenix, like for the last time, but one more time than he thought he would. And I think this, not knowing what comes next, right? This is kind of, it has to be a turning point. Like, options here are do nothing, run away from all of this, or stand up. And like, I think this is something that, like, stand up for oneself and in between Voldemort and the rest of the wizarding world. Like, this is maybe the greatest model. I have given you a model to follow. Like, I think I come back to something that I thought of actually, Wes, when we had our conversation at the Norwest Con about, like, what is the best way to learn something? Do you really learn it by sitting in Dumbledore's office and, having a nice discussion or a lecture? Or do you learn something by experience, like by witness, right? Like by watching somebody do something and being given a model to follow. And I think obviously these descents into the afterlife are meant to be instructive for Dante or for Aeneas. But I can't help but think that Dumbledore taking a underage wizard to go look for a Horcrux had to, and had to have known that, weakened as he already was, that this was maybe his last chance to teach him something. I think we'll see in the 7th book that he has one more chance to teach them something that he wasn't able to teach, and he teaches them from beyond the grave. And it's sort of, it's in a sideways way that makes them work something out for themselves, as opposed to just like writing it down and making them memorize it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to tie a number of things together here. I'm not sure I'm doing it clearly, but I think there's like, his options are to witness this and be consumed by it, or to witness it and be transformed by it. There's really I don't see a middle road for him. Maybe it's just the mark of character that he chooses the latter. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this image of standing is really, I mean, telling too, given that by the end there, Dumbledore, he's slumping, right? He can't even really stand, but he's still doing, right? He's still doing the protective thing. He's already sort of set in place the protection. The protection is lifted in the moment that he dies, right? And Harry doesn't even realize it right away, because he's so shocked, right? Of course. But they're sort of tied together, right? He literally is protecting Harry with his life. And I find it so interesting how the emphasis there in that long sentence, that semicolon after it, that is, he has to abandon the illusion, right? So that learning, far from being like a memorization of some new fact, learning is about shredding these illusions that might have served a purpose at one time, or might have given some kind of solace, or but they have to be let go at a certain point, and that's what I mean by I guess Harry sort of becoming a man in this part of the book. It's he has to acknowledge something that he was not ready to acknowledge until now, this kind of like radical just like impulse that he has been bequeathed, right, to protect and to be that figure for himself, because there's no one else who can do it, right? He even, and I mean, he wonders, certain things like about Dumbledore's, learning, his kind of factual knowledge, like, where did he learn Mermish, or like, where did he get those little funny, odd words that he would say during his commencement speeches or whatever, right? But these are sort of, again, just elements of a person that's profoundly different from him. Like, that's not who Harry is. He's not gonna, he'll get through his classes with the help of a magic book. He's not going to be like brilliant, but in another way, he has everything that he needs. He's always had it there, and he just had to kind of recollect.
I think one of the things, in the cave scene, one of the things that struck me, especially as I was listening, is how many suppositions Dumbledore relies on that actually end up being right? Like, I think I have to do this, or I think this is probably the right thing. And, I think it's really only the really wise or the really learned people who can sort of exist in that kind of, like, I'm not totally certain, but I'm going to operate as if, I've done all of my work, my research, and I've done all my, can kind of leap from point to point with great confidence in my own abilities, because there's so much that he's not really certain of, but they still operate on, I think that's something that sort of struck me as like, oh man, this is like the last, he's sputtering, right? Like, he's really at his limit. and he's kind of Dumbledore is. He's operating just at that liminal space of what he knows and is certain of, and what he's not quite certain of, which is why it's really interesting to think of that cave scene as kind of a really extended crossing over for him, right? Crossing over one river, crossing back over that river, but then like crossing quite literally into the space of his death. Like it seems like all very liminal. If I could also just say that, like, I'm kind of interested in what you guys saw. If anything, that's like, I had a really, like, not a hard time, but it came to me many times as I was reading and listening to this, these last few chapters, at how passion-like some of the scenes are with Dumbledore. Like that scene with Malfoy on top of the astronomy tower, to me had so many echoes of Jesus and Pilate. Pilate, who just desperately does not want to kill Jesus, and can't really, like, they're not really having a conversation about the same things, and that the person who is wandless, or who is powerless, is the one who is like verbally powerful, right? It is you who say that I am, right? I am, my kingdom is not of this world. Like when Dumbledore basically says, it's not your mercy, it's my mercy that matters here. And at the end, when he says, like, please, I thought of, I thirst, it is finished. And right before they apparate back to Hogwarts, when Dumbledore says, I'm not worried, I'm with you, I sort of had, I imagined like a very weakened Christ going with like Simon to the top of the hill. And then this whole episode between the death and the moment when the tomb catches flame, to me was just like a really extended Holy Saturday. There's the dying, there's the waiting, and then there's the rising that you don't know is going to happen. And just thinking about like what kind of fear and agony and grief and confusion and lack of direction all of the apostles and disciples must have felt, especially those most like closest to Jesus. Like, I don't know, this was to me, I see, and I know that like a common reading is like, oh, Harry Potter is Jesus like. I really think that Harry is not. I think he's disciple-esque. And like, you don't get all of the prescriptions. You kind of have to follow a model, and hope that it gets you where you want to go, or helps you cultivate the life you want to have. I think like your point, Wes, this is him like forced into growing up. It's also like, it's interesting that he's not forced into growing up alone, right? Even though he has to break up with Ginny, like there's something to how Hermione and Ron are kind of like, yeah, we will be like by your side. I think this is like page 651 or 652. Like, we will. His two friends are the last words of the book, right? Like, he's going to have partners in doing this, which to me is very like, where two or three are gathered, more road to Emmaus type thing.
Now, Wes, what do you think of that? I have to say, I very much like that, Sarah.
I had not thought of it in that sort of scheme. I thought of like more sort of personal things for me, like when I was a kid, the first funerals of people that I had to go to, those emotions that Harry feels there are, I think, very relatable. But then to sort of put it in a religious framework, I think helps to probably get at some of the more transcendent qualities of confronting death and sort of like seeing the ways that those who are living on are going to carry on some of that work and that memory in community. That does strike me as a really really relevant way to read this. And I mean, I think there's probably something going on there with Harry having forgotten all about the wedding, right? He sort of has to be reminded of these things, that like, you know, life does go on here. He needs to kind of retain perspective, and that's part of, I think, what Ron and Hermione are able to provide for him, because he does sort of leap very quickly to, you know, the way to protect Ginny is to break up with her, to leave her alone, and to go off and do this sort of task. He doesn't really consider that someone would want to go and do this with him, right? But then it, and if I recall, that is sort of like a major source of conflict in the seventh book, is like how they're all sort of working together as a team and all that. But I think as we see it here, it sort of crystallizes around that that concept of the wedding as this kind of like counterweight to the funeral. I found that kind of interesting. That is, yeah, the note that the book actually ends on, it is actually more of a kind of hopeful one.
Right. And I mean, I just, with the idea of like the Christian resurrection of Christ, and just more broadly mythologically, the idea that the old blind king, I guess Dumbledore would here be blind to the malice of Draco Malfoy, and how does this happen underneath his nose? And then he's killed by this evil force. But then we have these elements of rebirth or resurrection, the burning of the, I didn't actually remember that one, the burning of the white tomb. The tomb is itself white, purity white, hope white, and also the flight of the phoenix as well. There's that element of, or also Dionysian, of coming back, of something is not gone, but is going to return in some new way. I think I'm just saying that I agree with your interpretation, Sarah, and also yours, Wes, when I say that. But, well, first off, was it the case that the White King catches on fire?
Was it what that catches on fire?
The tomb sort of appears in a burst of white flames. So it's like the fire is like the spell that makes the tomb happen. Seems like it's on 645.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the fire, I think, like forges the tomb, and as soon as the fire vanishes, there's a white marble tomb encasing his body in the table on which he had rested.
I'm looking at that now. Yeah, and for one heart-stopping moment that he saw a phoenix fly joyfully into the blue, but the next second the fire had vanished. In its place was a white marble tomb, encasing Dumbledore's body in the table on which he had rested. All right, good. So there's a direct connection between the white tomb and the flight of the phoenix. What do you all do with that? Is that a symbol of some sort of rebirth? Is that itself a symbol of the re-embodiment of the archetype that Dumbledore embodied? Like, does Harry have to become what Dumbledore was? What was Dumbledore then? What does that mean? That just highly charged series of images.
I mean, I guess we saw the Phoenix, rescue Harry down in the depths of the second book. and it sort of has performed that function even for Dumbledore at times, right? It sort of like teleported him away from within Hogwarts, which is supposed to be impossible. So it sort of, I guess, to me, represents a kind of magic that transcends, like, again, like discursive knowledge or something like that, like even human knowledge, maybe. So there is like this strong intimation of a divine force at work here. Of course, the immortality element of that, and one that involves like sort of cyclical processes of birth and death and rebirth, right? So like the fire there. I think that the way that Dumbledore has been associated with the Phoenix all along is kind of part of his mystique, right? Like he does seem to know something that other people don't. He has this very unique sort of demon familiar that's associated with him. And insofar as he's been able to, he's passed along a lot of what he knows to Harry, but he certainly, by no means like told him everything. And so, that would have been a nice thing for Harry to have, probably, is like the help of Fawkes the Phoenix, but it's just sort of built into the Dumbledore character, I think, that that Harry's aid is going to take other forms. It's going to be, his friends. It's going to be these characters who care about him, like including Hagrid, whose house catches on fire, right? So there's a lot of fire stuff being thrown around here, but yeah, that's kind of the take I have on that.
What do you think, Alex?
Well, it's hard for me to top that. That sounded pretty good to me, hitting on the cyclical rebirth element and the fact that so much of Dumbledore will be lost, or there's so much that was unknown in him that is now just unknown. We don't even know the things that we've lost through losing Dumbledore, and I guess that adds also to the sense of loss as well, because there seems to be some element of hope lost too, because again, yeah, even though Fawkes is fine and not dead, Fawkes is definitely not hanging out with us and is definitely not close at hand. And so I don't know, it makes me think that this sixth book is ending on a bit of a dark note. It actually kind of recalls to me the tone of the fourth book that ended on such a dark note too. And I mean, I suppose these books, like the Aeneid, have each been ending in death recently. And I know that we've sort of talked about that quite a bit already, but I mean, it is almost as if this book is like the Good Friday of the series, waiting for the Easter of the seventh book. Like it is the dark night before the dawn.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I like.
Go for it.
Go ahead. I was just going to say I like the idea that this is sort of a series of dark nights. There's, and that I think the fourth and the fifth book also present us with a lot of darkness. I thought maybe even more than the fourth book, that this book echoed for me a lot of the second. Just like going into a cave where there's a lot of dark creatures, having to rescue someone from that cave in a way. I guess Harry having to rescue Ginny, and in this case, in a way, having to rescue Dumbledore. The encounter with incredibly dark magic, both the diary and the real locket, but also the entire like protection mechanism around the fake locket is part of the Horcrux system. And kind of at the end, being faced with like a bit of a reckoning. There isn't the same kind of death at the end of the second book, but I thought there was some sense in which there was a lot of there were some echoes there for me. Maybe even at the end when he rejects Scrimgeour's, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. I can't help but think of like Bill Nye from the movie. But when he rejects his request that Harry kind of make appearances in support of the ministry, I guess one of the things that reminded me of while I was already sort of thinking about the second book was how that book really deals with like the temptations towards being known for something that you maybe don't believe in or did right. So like Harry cultivating a reputation that he didn't earn as being heir of Slytherin, or Gilderoy Lockhart basically trading in on success of other wizards by lying about and passing off their stories as his own. I don't know. I sort of saw a lot of connections also because they're both like the second and second to last. And that moment at the end, in the graveyard scene seems so pinnacle, seems like such a turning point that I sort of see things building out and echoing one another in this like chiasmic way. I wish that's not an original thought. It's something that I read about somewhere, but yeah, I'm curious what other connections y'all see.
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking about the role here of Snape as this sort of counter figure to the kind of final battles that we've seen throughout. This is the first one that Harry seems to be really powerless against. He's always sort of found a way to triumph before. And it seems to me that the reason he can't win this fight is because Snape isn't trying to actually kill him, right? This is different. Something's going on that Harry doesn't fully understand here, and that Snape is not actually able to disclose at this time either. So it's like Harry's operating as the aggressor actually here the entire way, chasing Snape out, and everything he throws at him, Snape just sort of parries effortlessly. It seems like he almost gets overcome by his own rage, right? And messes up and attacks Harry when he knows he shouldn't. But he sort of is chased away by the hippogriff at the last minute there. So it's a really interesting, chiasmus or just like a reversal of a lot of what we've seen, I think, and is setting up for a very a big departure in the seventh book.
I really like that you note that Harry's role reversal here, like Aeneas versus Turnus, spoiler alert, in book 12 of the Aeneid, changing from himself a second Paris into a second Achilles, giving into his rage in that moment, that Harry is here, become legion, devourer of worlds, or has become anger, has become hate. As we've seen, again, this building in his role. And he's so overcome by emotion, it's all too easy for Snape to use occlumency or legitimacy to defeat him. He's all the more professorial in this quote unquote duel with Harry than ever. He's untouchable, and except by his own conceit, being called a coward really still gets at him, gets under his skin. I wonder what that means. And, that actually draws a parallel between him and Sirius to me, because Sirius also hated that sort of thing and hated that claim by Snape that he was safe hanging out in that house all the time, even though, obviously he did not like that. Sirius did not like that one bit. Yeah.
I mean, this is something we'll talk about as we read the seventh book for sure, but I love that idea that, or that connection that you made, Alex, that that this scene with Snape, on the one hand, not knowing the events of the seventh book, he's just this he's emerged as this incredible villain, right? He has the ability to fly now, and I think, is that right? I don't know. I could be wrong. But he emerges as just heartless. Everything that we thought has been confirmed, and yet he has those qualities that resemble Sirius. He's incredibly powerful. He is seemingly in control, dominating Harry kind of with every attempt. And I sometimes wondered, is there something about Sirius that's not Sirius, excuse me, about Snape that's envious, right? That there's if something were different in his life, would he have been friends with those guys? Did a part of him want to be friends with those guys? I think we'll learn more about that in the next book. But I've never really thought about how Harry is kind of in a dueling position, because he's always, for the most part, he's always been at a disadvantage, right? He's been dueling a basilisk or Voldemort embodying Quirrell, Voldemort, or, in some way he's been at a disadvantage, but here he seems to be at a different kind of disadvantage, right? He his desire to hurt is that's new, I think. Maybe worth exploring what that means, given what you said, Wes, about how everything is about to fall apart for him, right? And he's going to be, at the end of this book, kind of more at sea and without a sense of purpose. The seventh book is going to be such a departure for him. Be interesting to figure out, is this, him finally being reduced to the things that he hates, in other people. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think one interesting image of that is the whole sectumsempra hex or whatever. He uses it not knowing what it does at first, and he feels pretty bad about it and is justly punished and has to, read about his dad's old run-ins with the caretaker of the school and all this stuff, right? But in that moment, Snape has a weirdly Phoenix-esque thing where he sort of sings as he heals the wounds, and I found that really a strange and kind of haunting little detail there that I think goes along with what you're saying. There's this sweetness to Snape that's buried under all of the bitter. There's this quality where he's the one who knows the sectumsempra spell so well that he knows the way to heal the slash wounds that it causes, that no one else seems to be able to do. And that's the thing that Harry's rage against him sort of prevents him from learning from, right? In that critical, lost time of all his detentions when he could be out, hanging out with Ginny and his friends and all that. Instead, he's doing sort of menial, time-wasting tasks. He never, attempts to ask Snape even, what was that spell that healed Draco's wounds? They just never go there. And I think that's, it's not as sad as losing Dumbledore, of course, but it is another kind of loss, a lost opportunity. One that, again, I think makes Snape one of the more interesting characters in the series, up there with Neville. And Neville and Luna, going to the funeral together is just so darn cute.
Well, that makes me think that what the key to Snape's genius is that he uses his wide variety of hurtful memories to learn from. If you take the idea of sectumsempra as a particularly vicious insult, it cuts in subtle ways that many people can't see. but can bleed you out. Somebody who's been subjected to like an overly critical tongue over time might therefore, if they, come to understand the wounds that they sustained from someone else, how to heal those wounds in a way that other people can't because they can't even see them. And, the vulnera sanentur is interesting because it's wound heal, let thy wounds be healed, or wounds heal thyself. That's more of a Greek way of translating it, but it is in the passive voice in Latin. Wounds be healed, or wounds heal thyself in the middle, if you translate it like that, or wounds be, and it let them be healed. In any case, it's interesting because he does have such a variety of interesting powers. Like he can also create the wolfsbane potion, and it's almost like what he understands about dark wizards, or what it means to be a dark wizard, is to really understand the things that cause people pain in the world, particularly because of his own subjection to a lot of it, and that has been used to make him, a great wizard. But precisely because of the pain that he suffered, and that he does seem to be a little bit different from Harry in that respect, or does he?
Yeah, I think there's something about the way that, again, like the way that what we know thus far of his background is like, it seems as though Snape, when he was a kid, was, he had a lot stacked up against him, right? But he didn't really have a Dumbledore. It doesn't really seem like he had a protector. We'll find out what his life was like. So it also doesn't really seem like he had a Ron and Hermione, at least for all 7 years of school. And that I love that idea that like maybe Snape is capable of understanding and kind of moving amongst both of these worlds in a way that people don't, at least in the dark one, of dark, because he like is he is wounded in such a way that like one way to deal with those wounds is to wound other people, and one way is to heal other people. And I think, from right now in the story, it looks like he's like the kind whose oppression has yielded an oppressor, right? Or who's like history of experiencing unkindness has yielded somebody who's vengeful, except when we know that he is incredibly like in control and powerful, and he doesn't really seem to be operating, like you said, except for that one moment where he gets really upset that Harry calls him a coward. I guess, again, like some of this will make sense when we get to my favorite chapter, but no, I think that's I'm super intrigued by this. It's really hard for me to read this book, this particular part of the book, knowing what I know and remember from the seventh. And so I'm glad to get the chance to think about it without that trying to like bear on me,
Yes, it's much easier when one forgets everything that happens in the seventh book.
Fair.
Well, we better get to reading it so that we can forget it all over again.
Yes.
And hopefully, give our token to metempsychosis through this podcast element and move on to that Lord of the Rings thing. And I suppose if we're going next week and we're starting with 7, and we can text about, unless one of you has the book open right now, which chapters we want to read through. I just downloaded on Audible today. 2 things though, I guess. One is, Miss Sarah Miller, you alerted me to an interesting sort of debate on going on Audible about who reads Harry Potter better, Jim Dale or Stephen Fry. What was it? And I thought that was incredible. But also by next week.
Apparently.
Yeah, go on.
Apparently, if you download the book in Britain, you get Stephen Fry. And if you download the book in America, you get Jim Dale. And I think I only read that one article that I shared with you. But it sounds like their renderings are quite different and maybe interesting to think about. Not that we have time to like go back and listen to all 7 books again, but anyway, just
well, not in a week.
No, certainly not. But it's something to think about, I think, is what, how does the medium affect your experience of the story? Of course, that's always something to think about. But
and a good excuse to go to Britain just to download all those Audible books.
Amen, brother.
All right. And by next week, we might be able to unveil some of the particulars of our upcoming summer Shakespeare project.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. And that'll be.
Yay.
Yeah. And so exciting things coming up for all of us, including more British literature, because who can get enough? All right, y'all, bottoms up. Cheers. Till next time.
Cheers.
Cheers, y'all. Clink.